Hey guys, my name is Ryan and welcome to Hitscan. The new agent Skye is coming out next week, and in preparation for it we wanted to sit down with one of the lead developers of Balance now, Max or Orcane, to not only talk about the new agent but some of the balance changes that could potentially be coming with it. He actually goes into a good amount of detail on what to expect, which include buffs to Breach and maybe the other initiators, as well as nerfs to Killjoy and Cypher in the Sentinels category. Now, just to preface, in this video, he doesn't go into explicit detail on what these changes are going to be, what the patch notes are going to look like specifically, but he does tell us the areas that he wants to hit, and some of them are pretty obvious to work out how they're going to go about balancing it, but the rest are quite fun to speculate on what they could be. You can do that in the comments below, but also like and subscribe, watch this video all the way to the end. There's a lot of information in here, but it would be really cool to hit 350,000 subscribers before the end of the year. We're very close now, and we'd love your support there. But let's get started. I guess like with Skye's edition, there's plenty that we could talk about there, but there was no balance changes in the Icebox patch, which I thought was really interesting. So I guess before we really get into the meat of it, what is your opinion on balance at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally speaking, the game is feeling pretty good. I mean, there's no like major outliers these days. I think there's some, at least from like an actual like a numbers side, I think there's some perception-based outliers. You know, I think that folks tend to think characters like Sage are really weak, which I assure you, she is still extremely strong. And that's one of those funny ones where I think, you know, I'm very engaged with the community, and everyone thinks that, you know, we gutted her, but I still feel like she's strong, and all the data still says that she is in fact very powerful. And then, you know, there's some other ones, like people think that Jett, there's like some Jett stuff. You know, I think that Jett's a really polarizing agent. I don't think we're gonna do anything about her right yet, but it's definitely one that we're always like keenly on watch with a character like her, this like really high agency kind of like duelist character. I think that said, the big thing that we've been looking at is defender sidedness of the game. It's one of the trends that we've kind of observed over the course of the game. You know, when the game launched, the maps were pretty much 50-50 attacker versus defender sided. But as time has gone on, the maps have actually become more and more defender sided, especially at higher ranks. And that's something that we kind of expected a little bit as people learn to really play the game. You know, everyone's getting better at the game, and I think that defense tends to get better before offense gets better, if that makes sense, right? I think people learn how to be better defenders before they become better attackers. However, I think that to that end, there's actually a handful of things that we're looking at trying to tweak to make defense feel a little bit less oppressive, and probably mostly targeting some character changes in that regard. I won't go into any of the specific details, but you know, generally speaking, we're trying to make defending, I wouldn't say harder, but more nuanced, and create more opportunities for attackers to capitalize upon advantages. Is probably the best way to put it. You know, we want to make it so that attackers have really sharp windows to get in, and like when they do manage to, you know, get a pick, they're able to get more ground from it. Is probably a broad, vague way of kind of talking about what we're looking at doing. And I think a lot of this stuff, a lot of these changes that we're making are actually going to be in this upcoming patch. 1.11.
That's right, yeah.
Sounds about right.
It's basically, we've been working on a handful of these changes for a couple months now, and it's, yeah, probably like 6 weeks, 8 weeks, something like that. And a lot of these ideas are, you know, we wanted to get a bunch of balance changes in before the first strike qualifiers started. So kind of with the release of Skye, and I don't actually think Skye is going to be playable for the qualifiers. Don't quote me on that, but I don't think she is. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure on that rule, but generally speaking, we wanted to get in a like kind of this big passive balance changes before those games begin, because we don't, you know, one of the things that we really highly value on the team is, you know, kind of a stable competitive environment for our players that are competing at the highest of levels. We don't want to be constantly changing the game under their feet while they're in the middle of, you know, like trying to win a tournament, right? That's like a really bad feeling for those people. So we're trying to get in this big pass before that happens, and then, you know, kind of over the following weeks, probably have a little bit lighter touch on any sort of balance patches. You know, maybe we tweak a number here or there, especially with Skye launching. You know, there might be some tweaks we need to make to her, just as, you know, when a character launches, there's always stuff that we're going to be tweaking. But a lot of the changes going forward for the next couple of weeks would probably be a little bit lighter touch, just to kind of, we don't want to pull the rug out from all of our pro players as they're getting ready for this kind of like big first Riot tournament.
I guess that begs the question then, what kind of stuff is in this patch, if you can go into detail at all, even if it's just this agent's getting a buff or a nerf?
Yeah, we're looking more at, one of the things that we're trying to do more of is look at the game from like a role perspective and how different roles and types of utility are performing across the game instead of just specific agents. So for this upcoming patch, we're looking at initiators and sentinels primarily. More specifically, like Killjoy and Cypher are getting a couple tweaks, and Breach should be getting a couple tweaks. And along with that part is partially related to the fact that Skye is going to be launching and they have some overlap in some of their utility profiles. But yeah, those are the primary agents that we're going to be targeting, kind of to the goals that I discussed earlier. Yeah, I don't want to spoil too much.
I think a lot of people are certainly looking at the breach changes and expecting nerfs. So I know you say tweaks, and I know the idea of buffs and nerfs can be maybe not to how you would define certain changes, but how do you think the community would perceive? Are we basically looking at breach nerfs specifically, or this is a tweak to his kit that makes him a little bit worse, but it's kind of like Jett's right-click nerf? It has an impact, but not too much that you expect his pick rate or win rate to plummet. What's that kind of like for both Breach, Cypher, and Killjoy?
On the whole, my suspicion is that our initiators should feel stronger and our sentinels should feel slightly weaker. Breach is actually going to be getting like a really minor, like it is a buff. I'm going to put it out there, and I know that there's definitely some community sentiment around Breach feeling really strong right now. Internally, the data does not even remotely back up that sentiment, and we're trying to toe a really fine line between understanding why people feel that way and like what we see in terms of results. Both pick rate and win rate are still like quite low for Mr. Breach. And so we're trying to, I think one of our big theories is that a lot of our agents that have a higher requirement of teamwork actually end up not performing super well, because it's just a lot harder to do, especially in like in a pug environment. Like teamwork is one of the hardest things to do in any kind of game, and doing that with people, especially in solo queue, is like extra hard. And so characters like Breach and Viper is another one. These characters have a really high teamwork requirement, and they tend to not perform quite as well. I think even looking at the pro scene, we definitely are seeing more Breach than we did when the game first came out, where we saw 0 Breach. But even there, I feel like he doesn't have quite the presence as somebody like Omen does these days, or Cypher or Sage when she first was really, really popular. So he's getting a small buff. But again, I think this probably flies. I know that this flies in the face of a lot of the sentiment that folks have. One of the additional theories that we've talked about a lot internally is that even if Breach, like basically we have this data that says Breach is winning less than almost any agent and is picked less than almost any other agent. So we look at that and we're like, man, that's so weird. Everybody in the community is like, man, Breach is so strong, he's so overpowered, like he's flashing you for a gajillion milliseconds and you're just blind the whole game. I think what ends up happening in a lot of these scenarios is that Breach, everybody feels the presence of Breach in a game. He is like very hard to miss, right? Like he does blind a lot of people for a long period of time. He hits you with fishers, he hits you with ultimates. I think the thing that we're ending up seeing though is people feel his presence a lot, and I think that oftentimes that makes it feel like he's really strong and powerful, because the impact that he has on players is really punishing, right? You can't see, you can't move, like it's very difficult to deal with these effects when they apply to you. I think the difficult part of this is that he is not able to often capitalize upon these effects that he puts on people, and neither are his teammates right now. So I think that those two things end up creating this feeling of, boy, Breach is debuffing me all the time, but then I don't actually necessarily get killed that often after I've been debuffed by him. So he feels really powerful, but then the actual outcome of the rounds is not like reflecting that feeling that players feel when he debuffs you, basically.
Yeah, I mean that definitely makes a lot of sense. And you talked a little bit more there about particular roles and agents. You said sentinels and initiators, for example, but talk a little bit about, I guess, controllers like Viper, for example, too. Generally, the more teamwork heavy agents and all that stuff. If we talk initiators in this case, are you talking characters like Sova there as well? Because that's a character where I feel like with Breach, you can see that impact, you know, across both teams really in terms of getting flashed or flashing teammates, right? There's kind of two sides to that coin. With Sova, it's a little bit like, I feel like it's the sort of agent that a lot of people can, on your team, can feel like he is useful. But is he performing like you want to already, or is that also an initiator that you're looking to tweak?
So we're not looking to do, he is performing very well. He's performing pretty much exactly as we would hope he would. We're not looking at buffing him. When I say initiators, that's maybe a little bit of a misnomer because right now there are 2, but when Skye launches, there will be 3. And when we did this round of changes, a lot of our changes were with Skye in mind internally.
Makes sense, yeah.
So yeah, when we were thinking about it, it's like, oh, we're making these changes to both Skye and Breach. So yeah, sorry that's a little bit confusing.
Yeah, cool.
But yeah, no, Sova's been super powerful.
Cool, great, yeah. And moving on from that as well, you mentioned a little bit just about general, I guess, perceived impact by just a lot of maybe visual cues or abilities that you notice a lot and that sort of thing. And you mentioned, you talked a little bit briefly and touched on Omen. That's another character that I'd like to touch a little bit more on, as it's someone I felt is a very reliable agent and I feel like is really strong. Is that something that internally through data and looking at balance changes that you guys agree with, or is there something there that you are looking to either change, or is that does that maybe not even fall into that camp of an agent where the visual impact and the sort of perceived impact changes how players look at him in your eyes?
I think Omen's a really interesting one. I think that his blind ability alone definitely gives people the perception that he is very strong and effective. I think on top of that, he is also strong and effective, both because of that ability, and then I think the rest of his kit just ends up being very, very potent and very flexible. I think he also feels like a bit more of a self-sufficient controller, so he's the type of character that you can really reliably pick in solo queue, where it's like, I can put smokes for my team, but I also have a lot of individual agency to blind people and try to follow up with it, or I can teleport across angles or ult to the opposite site and like do a lot of sneaky plays on my own. Whereas I think a lot of our other controllers tend to be a bit more team focused, like buffing their teammates, really opening up a site for other people, putting really long duration smokes down. They tend to be a little bit less empowered as an individual. But I think that Omen's pick rate is pretty reflective of his power. I don't think it's something that we're necessarily looking to make a major change to. I think we're actually, generally speaking, internally pretty happy with the power level of Omen and the ways in which he's being played. I think if anything, one of the things that we're always going to be forever looking at, I swear to God, is looking at trying to get Viper a little bit more potency and Brimstone as well at some point. But those are probably a lot further out. But there are definitely things in our mind. Like we look at Omen, where we're actually pretty happy, generally speaking, with where he's at, and would love to see more. Our other controllers feel more powerful like Omen, as opposed to the opposite way around.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. And as well, it's funny you mentioned Viper, because we talked just before this saying, maybe we shouldn't ask about Viper, because we always do, and it's always the same answer. But I guess it is kind of the same answer still. One day.
I will tell you, it was the highlight of my weekend this weekend was watching
Poach
play Viper. Oh, and then they won. I was like crying in tears of joy. But like, to me, actually, that was one of the first games that I've seen, and I have, obviously I haven't watched everybody play it, but that one was like, kind of a higher visibility game where Viper was played and played very effectively. And I actually thought the way that Poach played him is the way that internally, like, I think that one of the refrains that the dev team has had for a long time is, we look at Viper and we're like, she seems like she's really strong. Like everything points to this kit being really powerful. And a lot of the ways in which we've always thought that, I actually think we saw on display with Poach this weekend, where the way that he was using his wall and smokes to like gain a lot of map control that teams had a really hard time dealing with. It's kind of how we've always imagined her being strong. So it was really cool to start seeing some of that type of play, and I hope we get to see a little bit more of that over time. But yeah, I think even with all that in mind, she's still one that's always on our radar.
I was just gonna say, Valorant patch in the year of 2030 will be Viper buff Sage nerf, and that'll be it.
just continued on. But I guess it raises... I think Viper had a better pick rate than Brimstone in that tournament, which is kind of surprising, really. And whilst you said that there are not going to really be any changes to those 3 specific agents for some time, it sounds like you're more inclined to buff Brimstone as opposed to nerf Omen. Like, obviously you haven't committed to anything because you said it's a long way off, but is that generally how you feel, that Brimstone needs more help as opposed to Omen being brung down a peg?
I would say generally, it's one of those things that we've only started really looking into that power imbalance in the last week or so, as we've seen Omen's pick rate continue to rise and Brimstone's kind of like fall a little bit. Basically, people are generally bringing a single controller in most scenarios in most whether it's solo queue or pro level, and they tend to be favoring Omen for a whole variety of reasons that I think are pretty valid. When we look at Brimstone, there are reasons I still think that he's pretty potent, but I think that he suffers in a couple of key areas with regards to like flexibility compared to a character like Omen. And I don't think that means that we should give him more flexibility necessarily. I just think that it's, you know, I think it's really understandable why people are preferring Omen over Brim right now. I think there are certain, like when I look at it right now, I think that there are certain maps where I think Brimstone is just as good or potentially even better in certain scenarios on certain maps. Like honestly, I think on Bind, Brimstone feels like a really potent pick, especially with his ultimate. I think he is able to control a lot of space there. I think he has a little bit harder of a time on Icebox and Split, mostly due to like some of those range restrictions. But I think that, you know, there'll probably be something in the works for him. But yeah, it's definitely a ways off.
One thing that you said about the initiators and sort of bringing them up, because they're supportive agents, you will struggle to do a lot yourself. You're very reliant on your team. I would have thought that that same mentality would apply to the Sentinels as well. It might be just because I am a Cypher Killjoy player that I'm immediately like, we suffer too with teammates not doing what we hope they do. But it sounds like, maybe not getting a specific nerf, but it sounds like to an extent they're maybe too strong in a certain aspect in their kit. I wondered if you can go into more detail about that, because certainly the Cypher Killjoy competition going on at the moment, certainly in like the pro scene and probably in ranked play too, but there seems to be some choice competition between the two, so I wondered what changes were coming to them. Broad strokes, of course.
Yeah, I think there's 2 like kind of general buckets with the Sentinel changes that we have planned. One is about making the decision between Cypher and Killjoy a little bit more clear and make it more obvious why you'd want to choose one over the other. Can't go into too much details there, but like they're basically, you know, Killjoy has always been, in our minds, this character who's supposed to be very potent at locking down like a single site, whereas Cypher is kind of a little bit more about creating this, you know, information network across the map. And so we're really trying to drill into those identities on both of these characters. So I think you'll see that in some of the upcoming changes. I think one of the other changes that's more like that's less of a nerf and more of just like a bit of a change in terms of how these characters end up feeling within the whole like roster. The other component is probably a little bit more in the nerf category, which is that a lot of both of those characters tend to have a very extremely high uptime on a lot of their utility. They create this kind of like global pressure and presence at all points throughout a match, as long as they're in the match. And so that's an area that we're going to be looking at trying to impact. It's, you know, very few characters are able to, once they use their ability, it has an impact for the rest of the round. You know, that's and like without any restrictions. So that's one of the areas that like we're trying to see if there are ways to encourage more clever use of abilities from Sentinels. I think a lot of times they kind of just default to like super high value plays. The one that is the like most egregious for me is like a lot of the ways that Killjoy's turret can be used to kind of watch flanks. You know, like we're not obviously gonna just get rid of that ability from it, or like that power that it has, but we're trying to make it a little bit more nuanced in how you can actually do that.
I decrease the range, those kind of areas, I would assume.
So it brought, yeah, but I won't say exactly what it is, but it's like there are a bunch of, we're adding some like restrictions with how those things behave.
It's interesting to hear what you're doing as well with the whole looking at the game in the way of like characters who initiate or attack well, and defenders who are strong, and looking at it from attacking side and defending side, and giving the attackers opportunities whilst strengthening the defenders that sort of need it, or sorry, the other way around. Yeah, giving attackers the opportunities and strengthening them so they can pair up against all these strong defenders, so that the maps aren't as defender sided, because that's not something I've really seen anyone have a conversation about on like Reddit, Twitter, or even YouTube that much about at all, talking about sort of attacker versus defender side. Last time I saw that discussion was probably when people were talking about split in beta. You know, that was last time I saw that a lot. So yeah, interesting.
Yeah, it's funny too, because like when that conversation was happening compared to now, like attackers have gotten weaker and weaker over time, as opposed to, I think, the perceptions being a lot more heavy-handed at the at launch.
For sure, that makes a lot of sense. The only agents that we haven't really touched on are the duelists, but I think for the most part they seem fairly balanced. Even Reyna's seeing a hell of a lot more play now after the Jett nerfs and the op changes too. So I wondered with those 4 agents in particular if people should be expecting any balance changes to them to, you know, up Phoenix, for example, or even bring down Jett again. Like, what's the thinking about the duelists?
Yeah, we're not really looking at doing anything in the near term. But certainly, you know, as we look at the game, there's probably some opportunities. Like one of the to adjust some of them. You know, one of the things that we really want to drill down into and better understand a little bit before we make big changes is something that I alluded to earlier, which was like individual agency versus like teamwork and the power of teamwork. Duelists are, you know, always going to be these really high agency solo characters. That's kind of always, that was their design, right? Like they're supposed to be the person that goes in and duels somebody, and they have like an advantage either in that fight or immediately following that fight. They create opportunities for themselves, but they're really sharp, specific opportunities. I would say that probably our general sense internally is that they probably are a little bit more effective there than we would like, relative to the way initiators behave right now. Because like I think in, you know, when we think about this game, a lot of the strongest advantages that you can create with debuffs and things like that really only feel reasonable and fair when they're happening from like a teammate. You know, the stuff that Phoenix and Reyna can do are really, really sharp, specific moments of opportunity that they create, where they're, you know, people are blinded for like a second, and if they don't capitalize on it and get a frag, then it goes back to kind of like an even gunfight. Because at the end of the day, we want people to be engaging in gunfights and having that determine the outcomes of matches. Debuffs tend to be a lot more tolerable and acceptable when they feel like they're, you know, it was like a coordinated teamwork play to make that thing happen. And so that's kind of one of the areas that we're trying to push. And I think these initiator changes are kind of done with duelists in mind. You know, like we're changing some of their debuff properties in response to, I think, some of the potency that we've seen in duelists. Because like I think right now a lot of like their power is like on par with the way that duelists behave in terms of how much they can break onto a site. So it's a lot about the balance there, as opposed to like the individual, like trying to nerf anything about the specific duelists.
So I guess the general like TLDR on that then is duelists can do so much on their own without the help of their team, which is something that you want to not necessarily pull back on because that's their identity, but certainly in ranked play, you have agents like Sova, Breach, and now Skye that's whole job is to set up your teammates to be rather supportive, but you want them to be also, to an extent, self-serving, certainly when it comes to ranked, because you don't really know how to coordinate with 4 random people, and in some cases they don't chat and stuff. So I guess you can expect Breach and Skye probably be a lot faster when it comes to pulling out their guns, for example, after flashes, as an example. Obviously I don't know the changes, but from what you're saying, that's my guess at least. It's
kind of, so it's actually a little bit I think you're pretty close. I think that the like re-equip times are actually something that we think of as being very duelist centric, whereas the initiators are able to have longer debuff durations or something like that, right? Like when Breach hits you with a concuss, it's for like, you know, over 2 seconds or 2.5 seconds. I forget the exact timing, but it's like a pretty long time. If that, you know, hypothetically, if we had that same ability on a duelist, like we would probably put the debuff duration pretty significantly lower, but you would be able to re-equip your gun a lot faster. So you're like able to capitalize it on yourself, but that window is really small. Whereas with the initiators, it's kind of this opposite perspective of like, I can debuff you for longer. I have more debuffs, and my ability to just like straight up frag somebody that's debuffed is a little bit lower individually. But if I pair that with my teammate, they're able to go in and capitalize on that longer window even more effectively than any duelist is on their own. I think Skye is one of the. I think Skye and Breach are both, and even Sova, I think with his drone more than many of his other abilities. You know, following in a drone, or with Skye following in a wolf, like you end up having a lot of that type of play that we'll start seeing. I think, where you're kind of trying to work off of these tools.
And that's it for this time. Thank you very much for watching. It's been a bit of a longer video, so I appreciate you watching until the end. But there is a second part to this where we go into a bit more detail about the new Agent Skye. So be sure to keep an eye out for that. Thanks for watching, like and subscribe like I mentioned before. And until next time, take care. We'll see you then.